Hi Management 4480, welcome to your next class. Today we're going to finish up chapter 9. I have my notes here from the PowerPoint and I wanted to explain what I put on the slides. So remember last time we started talking about strategic control mechanisms. And those are tools that we use to assess where we are in our progression towards our goals. And it also lets us know if we need to change anything. So last time when we first started talking about strategic control mechanisms, we talked about the first two of the three common mechanisms. And those were the informational control systems and the behavioral control systems. Today, we're finally going to talk about that third strategic control mechanism, which is corporate governance. So corporate governance is really concerned about the interaction and relationship between three parties. One is the managers, two is the owners / shareholders of the firm, and three is the board of directors. So the assumption here is that the owner and the manager are two different bodies, two different people, two different groups, right? So we definitely know of instances where there are businesses and the owner is the manager as well. So there is no separation of the owner manager. And historically, like over a century ago, it was more common for a business to be run by the person who owned it. But in the last century, as companies have gotten bigger, it's become we've just had a higher number of companies that's decided to be publicly traded, and therefore the person who manages the day-to-day operation is different from the people who actually own the company. And so the question becomes, how do we make sure that the manager is acting in good faith in the best interests of the owners? So in management research, there's this theory called agency theory, and that's all about the implications of the owner and the manager being different people. And so in agency theory, the assumption is that the manager and the owners have different goals and different risk preferences. And so when we have this case of not only trusting someone to advocate for the owners, but also just assuming that this person who we're trusting to advocate for the owners probably doesn't have the same goals as the owners and probably doesn't have the same risk preferences as the owners, then the question becomes, how do we really monitor this person? And if we need to monitor this person and make sure that this person's on the right track, that requires resources, right? And so it's like, well, what do we do to make sure that we're on the same page and this person is making decisions that we would want this person to make? So to answer the question of how do we make sure the manager is acting in the best interest of the owners, we draw on corporate governance mechanisms. And so the first most common mechanism is the board of directors. And so we rely on the board of directors to advocate on behalf of the owners. The board is supposed to make sure that the CEO is making, or the managers, typically when we say managers, we're talking about the CEO, but the board's job is to make sure that the managers of the firm are making the right decisions according to what's best to shareholders. Another corporate governance mechanism that we use is shareholder activism. So shareholder activism is more commonly something that institutional investors rely on. So in order to engage in shareholder activism, you'd have to own a large percentage of the outstanding stock. And so what these people do is they see that the manager is not making decisions that they'd want the manager to make, and so they basically push their own board picks onto the board of directors to make sure that someone within their own team is now sitting on the board to keep a closer eye on the CEO manager. So really, shareholder activism implies a lack of trust in the manager and also in the existing board of directors. And then a third mechanism that we would use in corporate governance would be rewards and incentives. So if we want the managers to behave like they are owners, then that might mean that we incentivize them by giving them stock options. So if the manager has a significant proportion of his or her income coming from stock, then the manager is also now essentially an owner. And so we're just trying to think of ways to incentivize these managers so that they can relate and better advocate for the owners. And when we are thinking about corporate governance, the question of duality comes up. So duality is when the CEO is also the board chair. So if the board is supposed to be keeping the CEO in check, then if the CEO is the head of the board, then there really is nobody keeping the CEO in check, right? And so there are some companies where the CEO is also the chair of the board. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we want the CEO of the company that we own to also be the chairman or chairwoman, or do we want these people to be two separate people? So CEO is one person and the chair is another person. So research shows that independence on the board is really important. And so what that means is the directors on the board should not be co-workers of the CEO. They should not have positions within the company. They should come from other companies. However, a lot of times independent directors are actually friends of the CEO. So even though they come from an outside company, they don't work for the CEO, these people are friends in real life, right? They might go out and play golf together. And so even if we do have independent directors, we still have to question, would this person feel comfortable being critical of the CEO if the CEO does something wrong? Would this person feel comfortable keeping the CEO in check if in real life they're friends? But you don't always know what people's relationships are behind closed doors. And so on the surface, they look like an independent director, but in real life, they could be best friends. So there are two different ways of thinking about CEO duality. So we have the unity of command perspective and then the agency theory perspective. So we already talked about the agency theory perspective, which assumes that the CEO and the chair are two different people, because we assume that the CEO has different goals and different risk preferences than the owners. And so we need the board chair to be someone different in order to help reel in the CEO and make sure the CEO is making the right decisions. But unity of command says that the CEO and the board chair should be the same person. and that there are benefits to just making sure that they're one person instead of two different people. And one of the key benefits is that when things pop up, when opportunities arise, when changes in the environment come up, then when you just have one person who's in charge of making the decisions, we can respond more quickly. So we've talked about internal corporate governance mechanisms, but there are also some external corporate governance mechanisms. So one is the market for corporate control. So the idea behind this is that if the CEO is truly making poor decisions that are not in the best interest of the owners, the stockholders, then the stock price is probably falling, and the CEO is probably going to lose his or her job anyway. And if other companies see how this CEO is consistently making poor decisions for the firm and the stock price is suffering, then that enhances the likelihood of a takeover from another company, because the other company will say, you know what, that company is falling in stock price, so I can actually purchase this company and make better decisions than the current CEO and then increase its value so then I can make money. So either way, the idea is that if nothing internally can reel the CEO in and help the CEO make better decisions, then externally there is a market that will make sure that the CEO loses his or her job and that another company will probably purchase the firm. And another external corporate governance mechanism is auditors. Another is banks and analysts. So we've definitely heard analysts make buy or sell recommendations on a company's stock. And then of course, government regulatory bodies like the SEC, and then finally the media. A lot of the times we find out what's going on within these companies and what decisions are being made by watching the news. So we learned that investor activism was one internal corporate governance mechanism that we could use to ensure that the CEO is making the right decisions. And at the end of the PowerPoint, I include an article about a time, this happened about 2 years ago, when Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook was facing a very public battle with an activist investor. And so they were basically saying that Mark needed to not be the CEO and the chairman. So Mark had duality. And the activist investors, which was Trillium Investments, they said that they wanted to appoint a separate person as chair of the board. And so it was this very public fight. And at the end, about a year later, Mark actually won the fight and he maintained his power. So he still has duality. And so in the PowerPoint, I explained how this happened. And for your next steps, I ask you to reflect on this real life situation. So I want you to share your thoughts about duality and whether you thought the outcome of the case was something you agree with. All right, so that's it for this class. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time.